Welcome, dear friends of mystery, to another tale where shadows creep behind lace curtains and secrets linger in the quiet corners of an English village. Tonight, we invite you to settle into your armchair, pour yourself a comforting cup of tea, and prepare to be transported into a story both cozy and chilling. What if a simple village painting could hold the key to murder? That is the riddle before us. If you love unraveling dark puzzles wrapped in charm, be sure to subscribe, like, and join us as we step into the mystery of the cursed portrait. The village hall of Ashcombe was alight with chatter, its oak beams strung with bunting, the air sweet with the scent of freshly baked scones. Neighbors gathered in eager anticipation, whispering of the long-awaited return of a relic from the past. A grand portrait said to carry with it both beauty and doom. The painting, draped beneath a crimson cloth, rested on an easel at the front of the room. All eyes fixed upon it, though more than a few exchanged uneasy glances. Tales clung to the canvas like cobwebs. Every owner, without exception, had met a mysterious end. The vicar cleared his throat, ready to make the unveiling official. Laughter and polite applause filled the room. Yet underneath, tension crackled like a hidden storm. Just as the cloth was pulled away to reveal the stern gaze of a woman in black, a scream pierced the summer air. The hall fell silent. From the manor gardens nearby came frantic shouts. Someone had been found lifeless among the roses. In an instant, the evening's cheer curdled into dread. The cursed portrait had returned, and already the village whispered. Had it claimed its first victim once more? Chapter 1. Whispers in the Village. Ashcombe, at first glance, seemed the very picture of tranquility. Nestled among rolling hills and framed by hedgerows heavy with hawthorn, the village looked as though it had stepped out of an old postcard. Cobblestone lanes wound their way past thatched cottages where roses climbed eagerly over whitewashed walls. In the square, the church bell tolled the hour, scattering sparrows from the eaves. To any traveler passing through, Ashcombe promised nothing more sinister than jam competitions and gossip over garden fences. Yet beneath this postcard charm lay whispers the villagers never fully shook. The manor on the hill, with its ivy-choked windows, carried a history best spoken of in lowered voices. They said its rooms were too quiet, its portraits watching with eyes that never quite seemed to rest. The recent return of the infamous painting had reignited such talk, rippling through the village like a chill breeze. To some, it was merely superstition, a bit of folklore to enliven long evenings by the fire. To others, it was a warning, as real and sharp as the toll of that church bell. Ashcombe smiled for visitors, but behind lace curtains, unease had already begun to stir. It was on a bright afternoon that Miss Marple arrived in Ashcombe, her small figure almost swallowed by the bustle of the village square. To the casual eye, she seemed nothing more than a kindly spinster visiting an old friend, her manner gentle, her steps unhurried. Yet her blue eyes, sharp as glass beneath the brim of her sensible hat, missed nothing. She paused to watch a group of women chatting by the bakery door, noting how their laughter faltered when the cursed portrait was mentioned. Miss Marple was not one to intrude, but she had learned long ago that people revealed much when they thought themselves unobserved. Over tea with her hostess, Mrs. Ellery, she listened quietly as the talk turned from flower shows to fearful murmurs about the death at the manor. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, though her mind raced faster than her hands. She had come to Ashcombe for rest, yet here was a puzzle already unfolding at her doorstep. And so, in her unobtrusive way, Miss Marple settled in, watchful, patient, and curious. For if Ashcombe's peace was merely a veil, she intended to see what shadows lay beneath. By the following morning, the grim truth had spread to every corner of Ashcombe. The man found among the roses was none other than Mr. Harold Green, the wealthy newcomer who had recently purchased the manor and, with it, the cursed portrait. His arrival had unsettled many. Some resented his brisk manner and outsider's arrogance, while others whispered of his plans to modernize the estate, turning meadows into money. Now, he was the subject of every hushed conversation, though no one dared speak too loudly, as if death itself might be listening. The doctor pronounced the cause with uneasy finality: poison. Not a stumble among the flower beds, nor a sudden weak heart, but a deliberate end. A glass half drained had been discovered near his body, its contents carrying the bitter trace of something deadly. For the villagers, this was both shocking and strangely familiar. They remembered the tales. Every hand that had once held the portrait had soon stilled in death. Yet beneath the superstitions, unease stirred sharper questions. Who had reason to wish Harold Green gone? Was it the portrait's curse, or something far more human in nature? Miss Marple, quiet in her corner, suspected the latter, and began to listen all the more closely. By evening, Ashcombe streets buzzed with rumor. In the snug of the village inn, farmers leaned close over their pints, insisting the portrait had claimed another victim. At the bakery, women lowered their voices as children darted between the shelves, repeating the tale of Eleanor Ashcombe, the stern lady in black whose painted eyes seemed to follow all who dared meet them. Some swore her curse was real, that she had vowed vengeance on any who betrayed her memory. Others dismissed it as nonsense, nothing more than old wives' tales. Yet even the skeptics spoke more quickly than usual, as if eager to be done with the subject. The weight of the manor's history pressed upon the village like an unseen hand, darkening doorways and drawing curtains early. Miss Marple listened with interest. In her long experience, she knew superstition often cloaked truths people were too afraid to name aloud. Fear made a convenient mask for motive, and whispers could hide both guilt and knowledge. As the legends thickened around Harold Green's death, she wondered which of Ashcombe's tidy cottages might conceal the heart of the matter, and which villager feared the portrait for reasons more tangible than curses. Chapter 2: Gathering Threads. Constable Wright, a stout man with a ruddy face and boots that always seemed a size too heavy for his stride, took charge of the investigation with an air of reluctant authority. To the gathered villagers, he spoke firmly, brushing aside their anxious talk of curses and haunted portraits. It was nothing more than a tragic accident, he declared, puffing out his chest. Food poisoning, most likely. Bad luck, yes, but nothing supernatural about it. His words did little to settle the crowd. A ripple of doubt spread across the hall, for Harold Green's sudden death had felt too precise, too sharp-edged to be written off so easily. When pressed about the glass found in the garden, the constable shifted uncomfortably, suggesting perhaps the drink had spoiled or Harold had mistaken a poisonous berry for a garnish. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the back, tilted her head and let the corners of her knitting click together in steady rhythm. She had heard such explanations before, convenient, tidy, and deeply unsatisfying. Villages often prefer their dangers explained away quickly, but truth was rarely so simple. Watching Wright's bluster, she wondered whether his dismissal was born of ignorance, pride, or perhaps fear of what a deeper investigation might reveal. While Constable Wright busied himself with official pronouncements, Miss Marple chose a gentler approach. Over teacups and polite chatter, she let her questions weave naturally into conversation, never sharp enough to raise alarm, yet always pointed enough to gather threads others missed. She asked the maid about the serving trays, inquired of the gardener what flowers had been picked for the party, and remarked to a guest on how quickly the evening had turned from celebration to calamity. It was in the silences between answers that she found her clues. The maid's hands trembled as she set down a cup, her eyes darting away whenever the portrait was mentioned. A half-empty glass, tucked oddly behind a chair leg, had been noticed by no one else. And there was that curious moment when one guest, speaking of Harold Green's health, contradicted himself without realizing. Miss Marple absorbed it all, as unhurried as her knitting needles, never pressing too hard, yet gathering a web of tiny contradictions. It was her way to observe where others overlooked, to listen where others dismissed. And though she said nothing yet, a shape was already forming in her mind, a pattern that suggested the truth was far more deliberate than chance. As the hours passed, names and faces began to crystallize into possibilities. Each villager carried their own story, their own burden, and perhaps their own reason to see Harold Green gone. First was Lady Catherine, once mistress of Ashcombe Manor, now reduced to living in a smaller cottage at the edge of the village. Her pride was a fragile glass, easily cracked. Harold's purchase of her ancestral home had been a wound she could not disguise. She spoke of him with frosty civility, but resentment simmered in her eyes. Then there was Edward Clark, Harold's ambitious nephew. Whispers spread quickly of the inheritance he stood to gain. Handsome and polished, Edward played the role of grieving relative. Yet his eagerness in discussing his uncle's affairs rang too brightly, like a bell struck a little too often. The vicar, too, stood under the shadow of suspicion. A man devoted to his parish, he had sought funds for repairs and charitable causes, only to be brusquely refused by Harold. His sermons lately had grown sharper, laced with anger that did not quite suit a shepherd of souls. And lastly, there was Beatrice Lane, the maid. Young, timid, with eyes that darted like startled birds, she seemed almost crushed by fear. Rumor hinted at a relationship between her and Harold, an indiscretion swiftly cast aside when it no longer suited him. Motive, pride, and bitterness touched them all. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire, considered each in turn. For though curses may haunt paintings, it was human hearts that so often carried the darker stains. That evening, Miss Marple found herself drawn to the manor, where the infamous painting had been placed in pride of place within the drawing room. The stern figure of Eleanor Ashcombe gazed out from her frame, dark eyes unyielding beneath the heavy folds of her black gown. Lamplight flickered across the canvas, lending her face an unsettling lifelike quality, as though she were appraising each visitor with silent judgment. Miss Marple stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. The varnish bore fine cracks, tiny veins spreading like cobwebs over the surface. Yet it was not the painting itself that caught her notice, but the frame. Its gilded edges seemed oddly uneven, as if tampered with or altered in haste. She traced the carving lightly with her gloved hand, her eyes narrowing at a faint seam where what should have been seamless. Behind her, the hush of the room deepened. Even the air felt thick, charged with the weight of history and rumor. To most, this was proof of the curse. To Miss Marple, it was something else entirely, a puzzle yet to be solved. Turning from the portrait, she carried with her the quiet certainty that the painting hid more than just paint and canvas. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The following day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Talbot, the village historian, whose cottage overflowed with crumbling ledgers and shelves bowed under the weight of local lore. Over tea served in chipped porcelain, he eagerly unfolded the tale of Eleanor Ashcombe, the woman immortalized in the portrait. Eleanor, he explained, had lived more than 2 centuries before, a formidable figure in both beauty and will. Married to Sir Thomas Ashcombe, She found herself betrayed when he sought comfort in another's arms. Not long after, Sir Thomas was discovered lifeless in his chamber, with no clear cause to explain his end. Suspicion fell upon Eleanor, and whispers of witchcraft took hold. Though never tried in court, she was condemned in the court of gossip, her reputation blackened beyond repair. On the night before her death, Eleanor was said to have stood in the manor's great hall and declared that those who wronged her, and any who profited from her ruin, would never know peace. Her portrait, commissioned years earlier, became the focus of that whispered curse. Every owner since, Talbot assured her, had met an untimely and inexplicable fate: illness, accident, even madness. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her expression politely attentive. Legends, she knew, were woven from equal parts truth and fear. Yet even as Talbot's voice grew hushed with drama, she considered another possibility. The human greed and guilt, cloaked in superstition, had done far more harm than any painted curse. Still, the story lingered, heavy as the scent of old parchment, a thread she could not yet dismiss. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Lady Catherine, who received her in a parlor where the curtains were drawn a little too tightly against the sun. Once mistress of Ashcombe Manor, Lady Catherine carried herself with brittle dignity, her silver hair swept back like a crown that had lost its sparkle. When Miss Marple gently raised Harold Green's name, a shadow flickered across her face. "I will not pretend I mourn him," she admitted, her voice clipped but steady. "That man had no respect for history, nor for the land he so carelessly purchased. He spoke of carving up the meadows, our meadows, for profit, as though centuries of care meant nothing." Her words sharpened with bitterness, but she stopped short, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Yet resentment does not make me a poisoner," she added, eyes flashing with sudden steel. "I would not dirty myself so." Miss Marple inclined her head, as though in sympathy, though her mind catalogued every flicker of emotion. Lady Catherine's grief was not for Harold, but for what he threatened to take from her: her legacy, her pride, the story of her family etched into every stone of the manor. Such feelings could drive a person far, Miss Marple reflected, though whether to murder remained uncertain. It was in the hushed corner of the inn that Miss Marple first heard the whispers. Two young women, bent close over their drinks, exchanged knowing glances as they spoke of Harold Green's indiscretions. With a soft cough and a kindly smile, Miss Marple encouraged them to continue, and the story spilled out like water from a cracked jug. Harold, it seemed, had taken an interest in Beatrice Lane, the maid at Ashcombe Manor. She was young, impressionable, and dazzled by the attention of a man who promised her more than a servant's life. But as quickly as the affair began, it ended abruptly, cruelly. Harold cast her aside with little thought for her reputation or her heart. Now, Beatrice lived under the double weight of shame and fear. Villagers noted her pallor, the way her eyes darted whenever Harold's name was mentioned, as though she carried a secret too heavy to bear. Some pitied her, others judged her, but all agreed she had suffered for Harold's whims. For Miss Marple, the revelation was significant. A broken promise, humiliation, a ruined future. Such wounds could fester into desperate acts. Whether Beatrice's fear sprang from guilt or sorrow remained unclear, but one truth was certain. Harold Green had left behind more than financial enemies. He had sown bitterness in human hearts, and bitterness, Miss Marple knew, was fertile ground for darker deeds. That evening, the weather turned restless. Clouds gathered over Ashcombe, thick and low, smothering the village in a heavy dusk long before nightfall. The air smelled of rain and iron, and the first rumbles of thunder rolled across the hills. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was no less unsettled. Guests who lingered after Harold's death spoke in clipped voices, their glances sliding nervously toward the drawing room where the portrait hung. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, noticed a change. The great painting of Eleanor Ashcombe did not hang quite as it had before. It was subtle, a fraction lower, tilted by the smallest degree, but her sharp eyes caught it at once. Someone had touched the portrait, and recently. The storm broke then, rain lashing at the windows, wind rattling the panes as if eager to force its way inside. Lightning flared, throwing the painted lady's face into stark relief, her eyes gleaming with ghostly intensity. A hush settled over the room, broken only by the crack of thunder. To the villagers, it was the curse breathing again. To Miss Marple, it was something far more practical and perhaps far more dangerous. Chapter 4. The Web Titans. Morning brought little relief to Ashcombe. Though the storm had passed, the village still carried the heaviness of unanswered questions. It was Edward Clark, Harold's nephew, who drew fresh attention. Handsome, confident, and always dressed a touch too well for village life, Edward seemed eager to step into the role of master of the manor. Too eager, some thought. Whispers of inheritance traveled quickly. Harold, without wife or children, had left Edward as his primary heir. The estate, the lands, and of course the portrait, all were soon to fall into his hands. It was a fortune large enough to change the course of a man's life, and motive enough to raise suspicion. Edward's alibi, however, appeared polished beyond reproach. He claimed to have been with several guests throughout the evening, engaged in conversation at the very time Harold is thought to have been poisoned. He even offered details, names, times, topics, spoken with the ease of a man certain of his innocence. Yet Miss Marple, listening quietly from a corner, noted something small but telling. His story shifted ever so slightly each time he repeated it. A detail added here, forgotten there, the shape of the evening subtly altered. Most would overlook it, but she did not. Alibis, in her experience, were often too neat, too carefully arranged. As Edward poured another glass of wine with practiced charm, Miss Marple's thoughts turned. Inheritance was a powerful motive, but it was not the only one. Still, Edward's performance left a thread dangling, one she intended to tug at when the moment was right. Dr. Atherton, the village physician, returned with his findings. Harold Green's death, he explained gravely, had not been caused by spoiled food or a sudden seizure of the heart. The traces in his blood were unmistakable, digitalis, the poison drawn from foxglove, a flower as common in Ashcombe Gardens as daisies. Administered carefully, it could kill swiftly, leaving few outward signs. The revelation sent ripples through the village. Anyone with a garden patch could have harvested the deadly leaves. The question was not who had access, but who had dared to use it. Miss Marple's mind returned to the abandoned teacup she had noticed at the gathering, left curiously untouched on a side table. She pictured Harold in conversation, a glass in his hand, perhaps exchanged or set down without thought. A moment's distraction could have been all the murder required. While the constable still muttered about accidents, the evidence now spoke plainly. This was deliberate. Miss Marple, calm as ever, considered the significance. Foxglove was not merely convenient. It was familiar. Whoever administered it likely knew both its dangers and how to mask them. This, she thought, was no crime of chance, but one of knowledge, preparation, and intent. Miss Marple found Beatrice Lane in the scullery, her hands plunged into soapy water, scrubbing furiously at dishes that were already spotless. The girl startled when spoken to, her eyes wide, her face pale. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost grandmotherly, as she asked about the night of Harold Green's death. At first, Beatrice denied knowing anything, shaking her head so quickly it seemed a reflex. But under Miss Marple's kind persistence, the truth began to trickle out. Yes, she had quarreled with Harold that evening. He had promised her more than he ever intended to give, and when she pressed him for security, he laughed. His dismissal had been cruel, leaving her humiliated and desperate. Tears welled as she confessed her fear. She had shouted at him, yes, but she swore she never sought his death. I hated him in that moment, she whispered, wringing her hands in the dishcloth. But I couldn't do that. Miss Marple watched her closely. The girl's anguish felt raw, unpracticed. Anger and sorrow were not proof of guilt. Yet Beatrice's fear was real, and fear, Miss Marple knew, could drive people to reckless choices. Whether it was guilt or terror of suspicion remained to be seen. Sunday came, and with it, the villagers crowded into the cool stone walls of St. Luke's. Rain drummed softly on the roof, the air heavy with candle wax and damp wool. They came seeking comfort, but what they received was something else entirely. The vicar, tall and austere in his robes, mounted the pulpit with a fire that startled even his most loyal parishioners. His voice rang out, fierce and unyielding, as he thundered against greed, pride, and the sin of men who thought themselves untouchable. His words echoed sharply, seeming to strike at Harold Green's memory, though the man's name was never spoken. Faces shifted uneasily in the pews. Farmers glanced at their boots. Shopkeepers fiddled with their hats. The widow Briggs dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from grief or guilt, no one could say. The congregation felt less like a flock gathered for solace, and more like suspects gathered for judgment. Miss Marple observed it all from her usual quiet perch near the back. The vicar's hands gripped the pulpit too tightly. His gaze swept too sharply over his parishioners. This was no ordinary sermon. It was a performance weighted with anger, almost as though he were fighting shadows only he could see. When the final hymn rose, it was sung in muted voices, the notes carrying unease rather than joy. As the congregation dispersed into the drizzle, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered. The vicar had spoken of sin and corruption, but had he been preaching to his flock or confessing to himself? Chapter 5. The Portrait Secret. Miss Marple's curiosity about the portrait had not dimmed, and on a quiet afternoon she returned to the manor, asking politely if she might take another look. The drawing room was empty, the storm light subdued, the great painting looming above her like a sentinel. Eleanor Ashcombe's eyes seemed to glimmer with knowledge. Her painted mouth curved in the faintest suggestion of disdain. But Miss Marple was not distracted by legends. She had noticed before the uneven line in the frame, and now she examined it more carefully. Running a gloved fingertip along the gilded carving, she felt the slightest shift beneath the wood. A seam. Her suspicions sharpened. Fetching a small embroidery scissors from her handbag, a tool as handy for mysteries as for mending, she worked delicately at the joint until a hidden compartment sprang open with a faint creak. Inside lay a bundle of letters, yellowed and brittle, bound with a faded ribbon. The air smelled of dust and secrets. Miss Marple handled them gently, reading enough to glimpse their weight. Correspondence between Eleanor Ashcombe and her descendants, filled with scandal, betrayal, and bitter feuds carefully concealed for generations. The discovery explained much. Harold Green, ever curious and ambitious, must have stumbled upon these letters after acquiring the portrait. And such knowledge, Miss Marple thought, was as dangerous as poison. For in a village where reputations mattered more than fortunes, scandal could destroy utterly. Closing the compartment with care, she felt Eleanor's gaze upon her still, the painted lady guarding her secrets even as they slowly unraveled. The letters, once spread across Miss Marple's lap, told a tale more poisonous than any foxglove. Written in an elegant but furious hand, they revealed that Eleanor Ashcombe had not only been betrayed by her husband, but had borne witness to generations of deception and shame. Hidden scandals, illegitimate children, secret debts, bitter quarrels, wove a dark undercurrent through the family line. Harold Green, ever the opportunist, had uncovered this correspondence soon after taking possession of the manor. To some, it might have been curious history, but to Harold it was leverage. He had hinted, Miss Marple now realized, at using the letters to pressure Lady Catherine. A woman so fiercely protective of her family's name would have been devastated by such revelations becoming public. But Lady Catherine was not the only one endangered. The vicar, too, was implicated. His family line, intertwined with the Ashcombes, carried stains of impropriety the letters laid bare. For a man who preached righteousness, whose authority rested on moral standing, exposure would mean ruin. Harold's discovery, then, was not merely inconvenient. It was catastrophic. Miss Marple folded the papers with care, her mind knitting together the threads. The so-called curse had nothing to do with spirits or superstition. The danger lay in human vanity, pride, and desperation to keep the past buried. Harold Green had threatened to tear the veil away, and someone, somewhere in Ashcombe, had been willing to kill to keep it firmly in place. The drawing room was hushed as Miss Marple gathered the key figures together. Lady Catherine sat stiffly in her chair. Edward Clark lounged with feigned composure. Beatrice trembled by the doorway, and the vicar stood tall, his expression carefully guarded. The cursed portrait loomed above them all, its painted eyes bearing silent witness. Miss Marple began softly, almost conversationally. Harold Green, she explained, had been poisoned deliberately with foxglove, slipped into his drink at the garden party. The question was not who could have done it. For in Ashcombe, nearly everyone had both motive and opportunity, but who possessed the knowledge and the nerve? Her gaze fell upon the vicar. He alone tended the churchyard, where foxglove grew in abundance. He alone possessed the authority to cloak fierce emotions beneath the guise of righteousness. And most damning, his family's name appeared within the letters hidden in the portrait, letters Harold had threatened to reveal. Exposure would have destroyed his standing, his parish, perhaps even his very identity. The vicar's face blanched as Miss Marple laid out the quiet details. The sermon too heavy with anger, the hands that shook at the pulpit, the fierce insistence that Harold's death was divine justice. You sought not only to silence him, she said gently, but to protect the illusion you had built. Pride, my dear sir, can be as fatal as poison. Silence followed, broken only by the vicar's ragged breath. At last his shoulders sagged, the weight of truth too heavy to bear. The curse, it seemed, had never been Eleanor's to give. It was man's folly all along. In the days that followed, Ashcombe slowly exhaled the breath it had been holding. The vicar, once a figure of unshakable authority, was taken quietly into custody, his resignation whispered through the parish before the news reached beyond the hills. Shock rippled through the village, yet with it came a strange relief. The portrait's curse had lost its teeth. The great painting of Eleanor Ashcombe remained in the manor's drawing room, but its power seemed somehow diminished. Villagers still eyed it warily, yet their whispers now spoke less of curses and more of human failings. They saw in Eleanor's unyielding stare not supernatural vengeance, but a reflection of their own pride, secrets, and mistakes passed down through generations. Miss Marple, preparing to leave Ashcombe, reflected on the matter as she packed away her knitting. Evil, she mused, rarely came wrapped in ghost stories or superstition. More often, it wore respectable faces, preached sermons, and hid behind lace curtains. The portrait had been no more than a silent accomplice, its legend a cloak for very human sins. As she strolled once more through the village square, roses climbing brightly over the cottages, she saw children laughing where once had been fearful silence. Ashcombe's charm had returned, its shadows dispelled for now. And though the portrait still gazed down with cold eyes, the true curse had been broken, not by fire or exorcism, but by uncovering the truth. And so, the village of Ashcombe returned, at least on the surface, to its postcard tranquility. The market stalls once again overflowed with jams and flowers. The church bell tolled with less weight in its echo, and the inn's laughter regained its warmth. Yet beneath that familiar calm lay the knowledge of what had transpired, a reminder that even the loveliest of places can harbor the darkest of secrets. The cursed portrait still hung in the manor's drawing room, Eleanor Ashcombe's unflinching gaze following each visitor who dared to look too long. But now the villagers no longer spoke of a supernatural doom. They had seen with their own eyes that the deadliest curse was not brushstrokes on a canvas, but the choices of the living. Pride, ambition, shame, these had poisoned Harold Green's glass far more surely than any imagined spell. For Miss Marple, the lesson was one she knew well. Evil seldom announced itself with thunderclaps and shadows. It crept instead through small lies, through bitterness nursed in silence, through men and women desperate to protect what they valued most, be it wealth, reputation, or power. The vicar's crime had been wrapped in robes of respectability, his sin hidden beneath sermons. Only when stripped bare did the truth reveal itself, that the so-called curse was nothing more than human frailty, painted over with legend. As she boarded the carriage to leave Ashcombe, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. She would remember the roses tumbling over cottage walls, the scent of rain on cobblestones, and the way villagers lowered their voices when secrets threatened to surface. She would remember, too, that in every village, no matter how picturesque, there are always curtains drawn against the world, and behind them, stories waiting to be uncovered. And now, dear listener, the question is yours. Did you believe in the curse of the portrait, or did you suspect all along that human hands were at work? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your theories. If you enjoyed this journey into shadow and revelation, do subscribe and join us again for another mystery where the ordinary meets the uncanny. After all, in every quiet lane and cozy parlor, there lies the possibility of secrets, waiting only for the curious to discover them.